Due to how prominent and ingrained they have become, it's always weird to think that accessories weren't introduced as a gameplay mechanic within the Final Fantasy franchise until Final Fantasy V. Up until that point, positive and negative traits that could be bolted onto characters through external means would instead be associated with weapons and armour. But since they have been introduced, accessories have become integral and have featured in some shape or form in every major iteration, with Final Fantasy X serving as the only real exception due to the customization options associated with weaponry and armour. Due to their importance, some accessories could be considered game changers due to how powerful they were, such as the fabled ribbon, which was transitioned from being a piece of useful armour in earlier iterations of the franchise to being a sought-after accessory due to its ability to often nullify all negative status effects. And it's because of this that some accessories have been made very hard to obtain. And in today's video, we're going to run through 7 of the hardest, starting with the Black Hood from Final Fantasy XV. Final Fantasy XV featured a pretty significant amount of accessories, and they could be acquired in numerous ways, such as being bought from shops, offered up to the player as a reward for completing certain quests, or as drops from enemies. Other accessories could also be found throughout Eos, with some of the most powerful hidden deep within the depths of the game's hardest dungeons like Durar Caverns and Costlemark Tower. But one accessory, known as the Black Hood, which will grant the player auto parry and the ability to pass through attacks even when running, could only be found in the dreaded Pitios ruins. And obtaining it would challenge even the most hardened of players. And that's because even though Final Fantasy XV did adopt a more action-orientated approach, very few expected there to be a trial found within the game that would challenge their dexterity and patience in such an extreme manner. Appearing as an optional dungeon, the Pitios ruins would only be accessible after obtaining the Regalia Type F, a modification that would allow Noctis's fabled car to fly. Described as being an ancient Solheim structure, Pitios Ruins was used as a training ground, and it's easy to see why that might be the case, as unlike many other dungeons that featured in the game, there were no enemies. Instead, the challenge would come in the form of platforming. To progress through the dungeon, which was comprised of 3 sections, the player would need to guide Noctis through a series of increasingly difficult obstacles, with unmarked checkpoints scattered throughout, providing the only chance of respite. Should the player progress unscathed from both a physical and mental perspective, their reward would be the Black Hood. But given how much pain and suffering would need to be endured along the way, many would be left questioning whether or not its acquisition was worth the sacrifice. Final Fantasy XIII featured an array of accessories that could do things like increase the wearer's maximum health, lessen damage taken, and provide resistances against negative status effects. But there was also a small collection of accessories that provided more unconventional bonuses to the player, and one of them, the Gold Watch, would be crucial for attaining 5-star battle ratings. After each battle, players would be ranked on their performance with a rating out of 5. Part of this would be to give players a benchmark for their play, but specific trophies and achievements were also created that would allow players to puff out their chests and show their accomplishments to others. The first, Superstar, will be granted for obtaining a 5-star battle rating against the second phase of the final boss, and L'Cie Paragon will be granted for defeating every Seathstone mission with the same rating. But that was not an easy thing to do. The Gold Watch would be a crucial accessory in helping to make this all a bit more manageable, as it could apply the time extension status effect that would shift the target time to being 1.1 times higher than the normal target. The only challenge was that acquiring the Gold Watch would be no easy task in itself, as it would require the players to defeat one of the game's hardest bosses, Vercingetorix. This boss appeared as the 64th and final Seathstone, and such was its strength that we even gave it an honourable mention during our second video about the franchise's strongest super bosses. But should you fell this devilish foe, the Gold Watch would be yours, and the task of attaining 5-star battle ratings against all of the Seathstone encounters, even the one against Vercingetorix, would become that much easier. The Genji term has become synonymous with weapons, armour and accessories of power ever since the term was first associated with Final Fantasy in Final Fantasy II, and those who played Final Fantasy V, where it was linked with the titular villain Gilgamesh, will no doubt remember the Genji equipment fondly. But for this particular video, we're going to focus on the appearance of this set of equipment within Crisis Core. As had often been the case, Crisis Core featured 4 pieces of Genji equipment: the Genji helm, the Genji armor, the Genji glove, and the Genji shield. And, as has often been the case, they each needed to be acquired through independent means, as opposed to being granted to the player all at the same time. But even though they would all be challenging to acquire in their own special ways, the Genji shield would end up being the accessory that proved the most elusive, and that was because luck entered into the equation. Unlike the other accessories, which could either be bought in a ship, found in a treasure chest, or granted as a reward for progression, the Genji shield could only be obtained if an enemy called the Magic Pot was appeased. Yes, that's right, Zack would need to perform acts on command in order to entertain the Magic Pot, and only if the correct commands were performed would it grant the Genji shield. The initial challenge would be having the Magic Pot appear in the first place. This would need to take place during mission 766, the Determined Recruiter, where it's believed the spawn rate would be less than 10%. Should you get lucky though, then the Magic Pot would need to be hit by certain commands that would be shown to the player. First, it would want to be hit by Gill Toss, then Costly Punch, then it would need to receive 9,999 damage in a single move before being finished off with Octo Slash from Zack's DMW. Only then would it be satisfied enough to hand over the fabled Genji shield, which would absorb all elements, resist all status effects, and grant Zack access to Auto Wall. Now, whereas many previous games offered players the chance to equip only one accessory, Final Fantasy XI, building on what was common within Western role-playing games, allowed players to equip multiple accessories. It would allow players to equip multiple rings and earrings, but accessory slots were also made available in 3 other areas: the neck, the back, and the waist. Each could be used to provide boosts to attributes, while also enhancing various skills, and they would be essential to maximising the potential each character had to perform with their specific job. But as is always the case, while some accessories were quite easy to obtain, either purchased from shops or the auction house, or provided as spoils from victories, there were some that just pushed people to the edge due to how tough they were to acquire. And in the case of Final Fantasy XI, one example that springs to mind is the Defending Ring. Equipable by any character, no matter their race or job they had selected, the Defending Ring would reduce all incoming damage by 10%, a huge amount for any character who might often find themselves in the firing line. It could not be auctioned, traded, or put in the bazaar, nor could it be obtainable from random prize draws such as the Godboy Mystery Box Special Dial. No, the only method of acquisition was to defeat the King Behemoth, a high notorious monster, and hope it dropped. According to the Final Fantasy XI database, after being spawned and defeated over 15,000 times, only 778 Defending Rings dropped, giving it a drop rate of just 5%. Now, that in itself might not seem too bad, but it's only the end of the tale, as to spawn the King Behemoth, you would need to have a savoury snack, and that only had a 15% chance of dropping from a Behemoth, another notorious monster. But to spawn the Behemoth, you'd also need a beastly snack, which could only be acquired after completing the Horns of War, an 18-person burning circle event. Based on all of this, and the fact that King Behemoth itself would also need to be felled, it's easy to understand why this kind of reaction was quite common when this elusive accessory finally dropped.
2058. Defendi! Oh mio Dio, oh mio Dio!
Final Fantasy IX featured its own brand of accessories called add-ons, and they could be used to grant characters specific auto abilities as well as enhancing their stats. But in an interesting twist, there were also numerous add-ons that had hidden penalties, as they weakened the wearer against certain elements. And before the days of readily available information, these weaknesses could only be found out by scanning your own party members. Unlike prior games, add-ons could not be purchased and instead had to be found, either in chests or drops from enemies, or crafted through synthesis. And because these were the only methods of acquisition, some add-ons were missable, while others were locked away behind some rather nasty foes. One add-on in particular, called the pumice, had 2 methods of acquisition. It could be obtained as a drop, and it could also be synthesized. But what made it horrible to obtain was that one method required the player to defeat Ozma, and the other required the player to defeat Hades. These 2 super bosses are considered to be the toughest enemies in the game due to how they were able to exploit the game's underlying mechanics and work against the established rules, and it meant acquiring the pumice, which was crucial if the player wanted to be able to summon the Terran Eidolon Arc, would represent a considerable challenge no matter how the player decided to go about it. The penultimate entry on our list comes from Final Fantasy VI, where accessories were known as relics. Here, they would form one part of a character customization system that was conceived by Hiroyuki Ito, which would see characters able to equip up to 2 relics in order to obtain specific enhancements. These enhancements could grant status immunities or positive status effects, and could even grant access to unique commands, such as the Dragoon Boots that allowed the wearer to use the jump command. But one of the most valuable relics, called the Economizer or Celestiad, depending on the version played, could be a game changer. Not only would it reduce the cost of all magic and lore spells to 1 MP, but it also applied to espers, and outside of Umaro not being able to equip the relic, there were no other restrictions. The only issue was that obtaining the Celestiad could be quite difficult. The traditional method would involve fighting against a Brachiosaur, a rare and very powerful enemy that only had a 1 in 16% chance of spawning in the dinosaur forest. If you could get through the fight unscathed, then the Celestiad would have a 12.5% chance of dropping. But given that Brachiosaurs were almost as strong as most of the game's hardest story bosses, that approach would be fraught with danger. Celestiad was also a rare steal from Galepides, also known as Aquia, but they too were also a rare spore, so the time investment required would be quite steep. The other option, which would be less costly from both a time and difficulty perspective, would involve the Dragon's Neck Colosseum. Here, players could be guaranteed a fight against the Galepides by betting a Mirakumo, and even if they failed, the item which they won as a result, the Holy Lance, could be used to fight against a death machine, which would in turn drop Mirakumo, allowing the player to repeatedly try and gain the Celestiad within a much more controlled environment. And that brings us on to the final and most recent entry, the Gotha damron, which appeared as an accessory in both the Final Fantasy VII Remake and Episode Intermission. In the original mission, this very powerful accessory could only be obtained by a single method, completing all of Don Corneo's Colosseum challenges, all of Chadley's VR missions, and all of the Shinra Combat Simulator missions. This would involve gaining a pretty intimate understanding of the game's core gameplay mechanics, as this would need to be accomplished on hard mode, and alongside succeeding in every prior challenge, some of which involved using only one character, it would see the players need to tackle 3-person team versus Top Secret, the only rank 7 challenge available. For this final version, players will be tasked with squaring off against hard versions of all the summoned bosses, including fighting Bahamut and Ifrit at the same time, before fighting against the Pride and Joy prototype. This was a notoriously challenging fight, with only 4% of players who played the PlayStation 4 version achieving this feat. For those who finished the fight, would be granted Gotha damron, the ultimate accessory that would allow the character wearing it to enter into any encounter with a full limit gauge, with the limit gauge also charging automatically throughout the encounter. When Intermission released, the developers decided to add many more Gotha damron, so that any player character could wear one. This meant 2 could be acquired after defeating Vice, a very hard super boss that could now be faced by the main cast, and 2 could be acquired by Yuffie and Sonon after they beat Yuffie and Sonon versus Top Secrets in the Shinra Combat Simulator. And with that, I think we're done. They were 7 of the hardest accessories to obtain across the entire Final Fantasy franchise. Be sure to let us know in the comments below which you found to be the most difficult to obtain, and of course, if you enjoyed the video, please be sure to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Alright guys, with that, this is Daryl signing out. I'd like to extend a big thank you to all of our Patreon and YouTube membership supporters, especially Anthony Hoffman, Benjamin Snow, The Livestream, Eric C. Del Roet, and Gregory, who are super special Onion Eye supporters, and of course, a big thank you to everyone for watching this video. I'll see you all again soon for more Final Fantasy goodness.